History or myth? Sometimes the two can get kind of intertwined and it's hard to tell the difference. And today's bake is inspired by one of those stories from history that scholars just can't really agree on. Did this really happen, or is it completely apocryphal? Well, luckily, I am not a professional historian, so I don't need to worry if it's real or not. It's a good story. Plus, with Netflix releasing the 4th season of The Last Kingdom, it seemed like a good time to cover King Alfred and his cakes. Alfred, the great King of Wessex, at his lowest point, brought even lower by burning some cakes. So that's what we're making today, Anglo-Saxon oatcakes, this time on Tasting History. This is my favorite period in English history, maybe my favorite period in all of history. It's the Anglo-Saxon era, and it goes from AD 449 to an abrupt halt in 1066. Though we could actually get into why maybe it's not so abrupt, but that's too much for today. Anyway, it's fascinating. Tons of warring kingdoms all smashed onto one part of the island, with Scots coming at you from above and the Welsh coming at you from the side, and then Vikings coming at you from every which way, and you couldn't go 2 steps without tripping over the relics of some saint. They were absolutely everywhere. In fact, if you weren't made a saint, clearly you have done something wrong. Now, we have a lot of information about this time period, but there are also some huge gaps. Most of what we know comes from either the writings of the Venerable Bede or from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, neither of which gave much to recipes or food in general. So the recipe for today's oatcakes is actually an amalgam of several different traditions around Britain. The Anglo-Saxons didn't write anything down, but people have been making oatcakes, or honey cakes, or ash cakes, kind of all the same thing, for hundreds of years. They still do it in many parts of Britain. So you've got your very dense, uniform, hockey puck type oatcakes from Scotland. In parts of Wales and the Midlands, you've got something that's more akin to a crepe that's actually hung up after it's done baking. And then you've got what we're making today, which is more popular in the south of England and is a little more husky, shall we say. It's perfect for crumbling up into a dish of cream and having for breakfast. So all I'm saying is, if you watch this and you're like, that's not how you make an oatcake, well, yeah it is, and yeah it isn't, but just have fun and relax. So here we go. What you'll need is 250 grams of oats, 1/2 cup or 46 grams of oat flour. You can also use regular flour if that's what you have. 1½ sticks or 170 grams of butter, melted. 50 grams of dried fruit, chopped. Now, probably best would be either dried apples or dried cherries, maybe plums, but they didn't have any of that at the store, so I used dried apricots, which would be available in England, in Kent mostly. They were brought over by the Romans, but they were very hard to grow, so they were rare. 6 tablespoons or 126 grams of honey, a 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and then an optional teaspoon of cinnamon. The woman in the story that we're talking about today wouldn't have actually had cinnamon probably, but it's good, so there it is. So add the oats, the dried fruit, the cinnamon if you're using it, and the salt to a medium bowl and mix together. Then add in the honey and mix that in. Then mix in the butter. Once everything is fully incorporated, add in the oat flour. Now you can actually add in the oat flour earlier if you want, but if you are using regular flour, you need to wait until the last step, otherwise they get really chewy as you work the dough. Then with your hands, form small patties, like a little hamburger, about 3 inches wide, and set them either on a plate or a lined baking sheet. Now it's going to depend on how you're going to cook these. You can either bake them in an oven, and that's why you have the lined baking sheet, or you can do as the Anglo-Saxons would have done and either cook them on a skillet or straight onto the hot ashes. But let's take a look at why that might not be as easy as it sounds. And frankly, it doesn't even sound easy. In 878, 13 years after the great heathen army had come to what is now England, 3 out of 4 of the kingdoms had fallen under Danish control. The great heathen army was a Viking army, and it was really the first big army to come and say, hey, we're not just here to raid, we're here to stay. And they were mostly Danes, but there were also some other Scandinavians tossed in. Only the Kingdom of Wessex remained standing, and its king, Alfred, was holed up in his fortress in Chippenham for the winter. It was the night of January 6th, or Epiphany, 12th night, and the Anglo-Saxons were probably partying. the Danes, led by Guthrum, who was not a Christian and didn't really care if it was Epiphany, decided that it was a good time to finish those Saxons off. He attacked Alfred when he was least expecting it, and Alfred and a few of his followers were forced to flee into the Somerset marshes. So something you need to know about King Alfred. Not always a fighter. Sometimes, but not always. What he was a thinker, notoriously so. So the story goes that Alfred, while he was, in the marshes with his men, decided to go out thinking one day, and he happened upon a swineherd's house, and only the wife was at home. But he knocked on the door. He was a little chilly, I guess, and the swineherd's wife was like, "Oh, of course, come on in, make yourself at home. But if you could, I'm just doing something in the other room. Could you watch these cakes and just flip them when they're ready?" And he says, "Oh, okay, sure." Well, Alfred, thinker that he was, got to thinking and lost track of the cakes, and they started to burn. And the woman comes in from the other room, probably smelling the burning cakes, and says, "You don't, you idiot! What are you doing? You're letting my cakes burn. I'm sure that you'll pay close attention when it's time to eat." And Alfred, berated but humble, said, "I'm very sorry," and that's the end of the story. Kind of a weird story, right? So as I said, history or myth? We don't know. The story wasn't even written down until 100 years after Alfred had died. But whether it actually happened or not, it doesn't really matter, because what we get is some insight into the Anglo-Saxon mind, which isn't that really what history is for? Before Alfred, kings in England, or what would become England, were supposed to be strong, warrior-type men, manly men who would have told Miss Swineherd, "Shut your trap, or I'll slap you upside the head." But Alfred was a new kind of king. He was the kind of king who, after he defeated Guthrum several months later at the Battle of Ethandun, organized all of southern England into a system of fortified burhs, or fortified towns. Towns that still exist to this day. And these burhs had standing armies, which was unheard of in England. Before now, all that you had was the fyrd and housecarls. Housecarls were professional soldiers that belonged to one house or one person, like a king or an earl or something like that. And then you had the fyrd, which was just like everyone else, farmers and stuff, and they would be called up for short periods of time in times of national emergency. But there was no standing army for Wessex. That's what Alfred created in these burhs. He also built England's first navy, which England becomes one of the greatest naval powers of all time, and it all started with Alfred. And maybe most important, he started the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is actually a bunch of chronicles. In different parts of England, he had an ongoing writing of what was happening in the kingdom, and this ended up lasting hundreds and hundreds of years after his death. It's pretty amazing, and it's how we know most of what we know about this time period in England. Alfred was just nuts about education, which was not common and hadn't been common in England, at least, since the Romans left. One of my favorite Alfred quotes, and maybe one of my favorite quotes ever, is, "The saddest thing about any man is that he be ignorant, and the most exciting thing is that he knows." I just adore King Alfred, and he is definitely worthy of the sobriquet the Great. And that's why it makes me feel a little better that even Mr. the Great kind of screwed up oatcakes, because it turns out I am terrible at flipping them. But we're going to give it a shot anyway. Now, before we get started cooking our cakes, I would appreciate if you are enjoying this video, hit that like button, and while you're down there, subscribe and tap the notification bell. It's great for the YouTube algorithm and will let me keep making these episodes of Tasting History. So the most rudimentary way of making these cakes is to lay them straight onto hot ash, which is why they're sometimes called ash cakes. But I have a gas fireplace, so that ain't gonna really work. So I'm going to do the next best thing and use a frying pan. So take your frying pan or your skillet or whatever flat metal surface you've got and put it over medium-high heat. Once it's nice and hot, gently place your oatcake onto the surface and leave it for about 90 seconds. Now here's the first place where it gets hard. Is it done? Is it not? We don't know. We can't see the bottom. You want it to be slightly scorched, but not too much, because you don't want that burnt flavor. Yeah, so I did 90 seconds. Maybe look at it a little bit earlier. Now we get to the even harder part, for me at least, which is flipping the thing. And I'm sure that there is a wonderful technique out there, and if I were a French chef like Jacques Pepin, I could just be voila! But I'm not French, and I'm not a trained chef, so yeah, you'll see. So using a spatula, flip the cake over and let the other side cook for about 60 to 90 seconds. Then remove it from the pan and let it cool on a cooling rack. Now you're only going to see one of these because that's all that actually made it. I screwed up like 5 before that. So after I got one semi-successful oat cake, I ended up just baking the rest. So if you're going to bake them, it's so much easier. Just put them onto the lined baking sheet, turn your oven to 350 degrees, and pop them in. Bake them for 10 to 12 minutes or until the edges start to brown. So here we are. Skillet, oven. Oven, skillet. I'm going to try both. First, the skillet. It's really good. Now the oven one. Okay. I like the skillet one better. The oven one is actually softer. It's more like an oatmeal cookie. But the skillet one, that little bit of char on there, it really adds to the flavor. Especially because you have the sweetness of the honey and the fruit, and then this ever slow slightly bitterness from the char is just, those are really good. Yeah, and they're super easy to make, especially if you bake them. Anyway, the recipe and the ingredients are linked below, as well as some of my favorite books on Anglo-Saxon England. And I had to pare it down because I own a lot. So I just put a few that are light reading and just really, really good if you're interested in that time period. So make sure to hit that like button and join me next time on Tasting History. Very campfire-y. It's nice.